can't get pum a prison. And next man have your girl when you're missing.
To that, which is that, I mean, in one sense, that the way in which that would potentially come into to play would be if the court is considering applying the proviso, and there would be, in our submission, a potential, if the court was effectively thinking of rejecting on that basis, there would potentially be a value in having a retrial on that issue because of the value of, in one sense, the correct approach, the weight to be given to the constitutional breach might be an issue for the Jamaican courts. I'm not inviting I mean, ultimately we submit the appeal should be allowed, but I'm just looking at, in one sense, a hypothetical example where, or a potential outcome, which is the court coming to the conclusion that the test was wrong, but the correct test would have made no difference. And I just would add a note of caution about this court. If it's a balancing exercise which has to give weight to non-compliance, question mark really whether this court's in the best position to assess that, given the importance of, in one sense, local assessment of the importance of the Charter. Can I then turn to the jury issues? A couple of preliminary points about the jury issues. Firstly, it is in our submission important to consider the jury issues together. In part, although we would say that any of the individual jury issues are sufficient for us to succeed, in part because if we're right that ultimately the question that this court has to ask itself is whether the fair-minded bystander would conclude there's a lack of independence and impartiality. Everything to some extent comes together because it's ultimately the final position that was reached. Was that verdict reached by a body but which by the stage it was reaching its verdict was independent and impartial? And that's a reason potentially for considering everything together. And they do link in one sense, because obviously one of the concern, you'll be aware that we make submissions about what's described at times as the second incident, which in one sense for our purposes is actually the first incident, which is the juror who was discharged. But of course the juror who was released from the jury, one of the reasons that is of potential relevance is that seems to put pressure on the trial judge because he can't release any more jurors. And that's where he gets into this difficult situation where he knows that there is a juror who is attempting to bribe members of the jury, but they are allowed to continue to serve. Had they not been allowed to continue to serve, then the jury would have had to be discharged because of what had happened the second time.
So there were three incidents. I don't think you're making any submissions in relation to the first.
No, exactly. That's why I was saying.
So we refer to incidents 2 and 3. 2 and 3.
I was going to use that language, but I was in one sense, in terms of what we're arguing, 2 is 1, but that's where the slight complication came from. But yes,
we better stick with 2 and 3.
I wanted to make clear. I wanted to make sure everyone was using the same language in that way. Yes, absolutely. The second thing is that, in particular, in relation to the, and it's important not to lose sight of this when one gets into the detail, in relation to, in one sense, the third incident in particular, the Crown puts very heavy weight on the directions given by the judge. Now, I'll make some submissions about those directions. But there is a fundamental problem in our submission by the time of the third incident. By the time of the third incident, the judge is proceeding on the basis that one of the jurors has attempted to bribe the other members of the jury. He's committed, potentially, a very serious criminal offence, and we in fact know he was convicted of that serious offence, and indeed he was arrested immediately after the verdict. While it may be right to assume for many jurors that they will comply with directions, if someone has demonstrated that they are willing to commit a serious criminal offence in the context of this trial, how can one then rely on their compliance with directions? It's unrealistic in our submission in those circumstances. And that's an important factor not to lose sight of, because it, in one sense, one can get wrapped up in the weeds of what happens, and it's important to go into the details. But one shouldn't lose sight of that overall problem, and it's a very significant problem in our submission, and it's just an insolvable one. It may have been deeply regrettable in Jamaica that a trial that has gone on for so long had to be restarted, but ultimately, if that's what's required to ensure that the trial is fair, then that's what's required.
There's nothing in Jamaican law that allows a judge to continue as judge alone without a jury.
No. And my lady's raised that point, and we've sort of thought about it, and obviously there is now in English law, it's a relatively recent development.
Yes, when there's jury tampering.
When there's jury tampering. And if jury tampering is a major problem in Jamaica, in one sense, that's the solution. My learned friend says, I'll come on to those submissions, you can't allow someone effectively to derail the trial. But if derailing the trial is a serious problem in Jamaica, well, there is a solution that's been adopted in England but hasn't been adopted in Jamaica.
At what point, or if any, when it is exactly the responses, or if the other jurors could have said that that wasn't the case at the time, if a proper inquiry and asking each and every juror, not even suggesting that it be done on the oath, but if it was asked what their responses would have been for the judge to make an informed decision. And I say this in the context that, in light of the fact that our Constitution, it places even a duty on the judge to, as the custos morum of the Constitution, to protect the rights of the appellants, that it was incumbent on him to ensure that he makes the inquiry so he protects the fair trial right. So that would be in response to your question as it connects. So what flows from that then is when we get to the late retirement, we have a juror who is the fruit of the poisonous tree, or the introduction of the poison, no knowledge of how far the poison is. I'm not inviting the court to speculate, but that's all we are left to do, respectfully. And what happens in that situation is we don't know if the pressure arises because there was a situation where these jurors were able to say, I would participate in a bribe, allegedly, or not. And so the verdict that comes could never be a true verdict in light of that. So that's the submission as it connects from incident 2 to incident 3. Now, in relation to the proviso, and I think you had knocked some of the wind out of me, say, Lord Reed, because I would have borrowed your words in the judgment to say that you can't proviso unfairness, you can't proviso injustice. It's just not possible. It would have been an absurdity in the law.
In one sense, you have my point. As long as there are.
I mean, you were saying it's just a question of counting the number of live bodies on the jury, and
that's all it's saying.
Yeah.
Well, my learned friends, in my submission, that's what it's saying.
Yeah.
Yes. And my lord, after all, one doesn't know. I mean, at the time the judge gives his direction and decides what to do, he might be hopeful, hoping against hope, so to speak, that the miscreant juror will actually just see sense. But it doesn't follow in my submission from this act that the judge is bound to get rid of that juror. That's the question. But I agree, if he's bound to get rid of that juror, he's bound to bring the case to an end for that very reason. And this is why it is a short point, but in my submission a difficult and interesting point. I haven't addressed you on the proviso and things like that, but I'm conscious of the time. But I wouldn't mind showing you some of the evidence. I mean, it is, because I do connect it to my point. Well, there was no need for any, if I can put it this way. Anyone looking at the evidence would say, I couldn't care less about these bribes, so what? I've seen it with my own two eyes, type of thing. Forget the bribe.
Yes.
But I'm conscious, my lord, I'm preying on your time. I don't know how you want to proceed. I see what the time is now.
Well, obviously you have more time tomorrow. We perhaps, speaking for myself, the point you've made about how you could find out after the event that a juror was corrupt. And the question then is if the other jurors had voted 10-1 to convict, completely ignorant of the fact that would the verdict nevertheless be vitiated, and it would have to. And I think if it were, it would be on the basis that we've been discussing, that there is, as it were, a non-quorate
non-quorate point, really, yeah.
Which suggests it may suggest that the point we made earlier, the point I made earlier about based on Seraphin may not be quite as obvious when you have 11 judges, as it were, as it is where you've got one judge.
As in that case.
Well, shall we leave it there, Philip?
I'm so sorry. The case that you mentioned in Strasbourg about the racist members of the jury, do you have the reference?
Yeah, Mr. Turnbull has the reference. It's Gregory v. UK, at page 7914. And I have a feeling there are two other cases which similar issues arose, which I cannot quite remember. If you give me one, sorry? Sander's one of them. Is there? And there was another one too.
There's a Russian case, which is not exactly on point, Tinkov.
Oh yes, there's the Russian case, that's right, yes. Yeah.
8373.
At 8373, thank you.
Very well.
Sander, please.
Sorry, Ed.
7960.
Thank you.
Well, I think we may have reached a convenient point to adjourn for the day. We'll consider where we are in relation to the JS2 point ourselves, and we'll look forward to hearing the remainder of your submissions tomorrow, Mr. Knox.
I would like to.